The champagne was still bubbling in her glass when her husband of 10 years took the microphone, looked out at the sea of Wall Street's elite, and publicly asked for a divorce. He smiled, handing the stage to his young mistress, bragging about a billion-dollar merger that would make him a king. But as the crowd gasped and cameras flashed, Claire didn't cry. She simply reached into her Chanel bag, pulled out the finalized contract, and prepared to destroy him. The rain in Manhattan that Tuesday evening felt like a baptism, washing away the grime of the city, but for Claire Montgomery, it was the perfect cover for the death of her marriage. Sitting in the back of a blacked-out Lincoln Navigator, she watched the neon lights of Times Square bleed across the tinted glass. In her lap rested a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. Inside it was a document that held the power to shatter a tech empire, decimate a fragile male ego, and rewrite her entire future. 10 years ago, Claire and Richard Harrison were just two broke kids sharing a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in Brooklyn. Richard had the charisma, the kind of blinding, golden retriever charm that could talk a venture capitalist out of $1 million over a casual coffee at Starbucks. But Claire had the brains. When Richard's fledgling logistics startup, Harrison Dynamics, was hemorrhaging money and 6 weeks away from total bankruptcy, it was Claire who stayed awake for 72 hours straight, fueled by Adderall and cheap bodega coffee, rewriting the entire algorithmic architecture of his routing software. She saved his company. She built the foundation of his fortune. And what did she get in return? A discreet wedding at City Hall, a diamond ring that Richard made sure to photograph for his Instagram, and a life relegated to the shadows. "You're the secret weapon, Claire," Richard used to tell her, kissing her forehead as he adjusted his custom Tom Ford ties in the mirror, before heading out to ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. The world doesn't know how the sausage is made. They just need to see the visionary. It's better this way. No media scrutiny for you. You get to live in peace. For a long time, she believed him. She let him take the cover of Forbes and Bloomberg Business Week. She smiled quietly in the background at charity galas when industry titans like the partners at Sequoia Capital or Goldman Sachs shook his hand and called him the next Steve Jobs. She played the dutiful, quiet wife, managing their sprawling penthouse in Tribeca, and acting as the silent patch coder whenever his development team hit a wall they couldn't scale. But visionaries, Claire soon learned, are often just narcissists with good PR teams. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. As Harrison Dynamics ballooned into a multi-hundred-million-dollar enterprise, Richard's ego expanded to fill every room he entered. He began to believe his own myth. He started referring to the algorithm, her algorithm, as a dream he had in the shower. He stopped asking for her input, and then he hired Olivia Pierce. Olivia was 26, a former public relations executive from Ogilvy with a master's degree in ruthlessness and a penchant for wearing stilettos that cost more than Claire's first car. Richard brought her in as the Chief Strategy Officer, a title that was as hollow as Olivia's sycophantic praise. Claire wasn't stupid. She saw the lingering glances. She noticed the sudden influx of late-night strategy meetings at the Four Seasons. She smelled the Maison Francis Kirkjan perfume clinging to Richard's lapels when he stumbled into their penthouse at 3 a.m. The definitive proof, however, hadn't come from a stray text message or lipstick on a collar. It came from Richard's own monumental arrogance. 6 months ago, while Richard was in Davos mingling with European billionaires, Claire had logged into his supposedly secure private server to fix a critical database failure his overpaid engineers couldn't diagnose. While navigating the root directory, she found a hidden folder titled Project Phoenix. Inside were emails between Richard, Olivia, and a high-powered divorce attorney. Richard wasn't just planning to leave Claire. He was planning to leave her with nothing. The emails detailed a strategy to funnel the intellectual property of Harrison Dynamics into a shell corporation managed by Olivia, systematically diluting Claire's marital assets. More sickeningly, Richard was relying on an upcoming merger to fund his new life. He was negotiating a $1.2 billion acquisition with the Vanguard Group, one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the planet. The buyout would make Richard a billionaire, allow him to discard Claire with a paltry severance alimony, and crown Olivia as the new queen of New York high society. "She's dead weight, Olivia," Richard had written in one email. "Claire doesn't understand the modern corporate landscape. She's a basement coder. Once Vanguard signs on the dotted line at the Gala, I'm cutting the dead wood. We'll be in St. Bart's by Christmas." Reading those words hadn't broken Claire's heart. It had frozen it. She didn't cry. She didn't throw his tailored suits out the window onto the busy Manhattan streets. Instead, she picked up her phone and made a call to an old friend, a ghost from her MIT days who was now a senior auditor at Vanguard. For 6 months, Claire played the fool. She kissed her husband on the cheek. She organized his dry cleaning. She listened to him berate her over dinner about how she needed to dress better and act more refined for the upcoming Harrison Dynamics annual gala at the Plaza Hotel, where the Vanguard deal was set to be publicly finalized. What Richard didn't know, what his monumental hubris prevented him from even considering, was that Vanguard hadn't just blindly agreed to a billion-dollar acquisition. They had required a third-party technological audit of the Harrison Dynamics algorithm to ensure it was scalable. And the firm they hired to do the audit was a secretive tech consulting group called Aegis Solutions. Aegis Solutions was a holding company. Its sole proprietor was Claire Montgomery. Over the past 6 months, operating under airtight NDAs and utilizing a proxy legal team, Claire had methodically stripped away Richard's leverage. She proved to Vanguard that the core algorithm was heavily flawed without the manual patches she secretly applied every month. She proved that Richard was a figurehead. And, most importantly, she registered the original, unassailable copyright for the core code under her own name, a detail Richard had forgotten to secure in the early days of their marriage. Vanguard didn't want Richard Harrison. They wanted the architect. They wanted Claire. And tonight, at the Plaza Hotel, they were going to get her. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sensory overload of wealth, power, and unapologetic excess. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small cars, rained golden light over 50 circular tables draped in heavy white silk. The room smelled of expensive orchids, roasted truffles, and the cold, metallic scent of extreme ambition. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided across the floor, balancing silver trays loaded with flutes of Dom Perignon and beluga caviar. Tonight was the Harrison Dynamics annual gala, heavily sponsored by tech giants and Wall Street titans. It was the social event of the season, effectively serving as Richard Harrison's coronation. When Claire arrived, stepping out of her town car onto the red carpet that spilled onto Fifth Avenue, the paparazzi barely registered her presence. A few flashes popped, mostly out of obligation, before the photographers turned their lenses back down the street, hunting for celebrities, politicians, or the tech bros of the hour. Claire didn't mind. She stood under the ornate awning, pulling her coat tighter against the brisk November wind. She wasn't wearing the conservative, matronly dresses Richard usually picked out for her. Tonight, she wore a breathtaking, custom emerald green Carolina Herrera gown that clung to her figure like liquid glass, paired with vintage Cartier diamond drops that had once belonged to her grandmother. She looked sharp, dangerous, and completely out of character for the mousy wife the tech blogs occasionally whispered about. Richard was already inside, holding court near the ice sculpture that bore his company's logo. I was surrounded by a sycophantic circle of junior executives and a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. When Claire approached, Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. He broke away from the crowd, grabbing her upper arm a little too tightly, his fingers digging into her skin. "You're late," he hissed, his voice dropping an octave to avoid being overheard over the jazz quartet playing in the corner. "And what the hell are you wearing? You look like you're trying out for a James Bond movie. I told you to wear the black Prada." "The Prada was too tight," Claire lied smoothly, her voice a calm, unruffled pond. "Besides, it's a big night, Richard. I wanted to dress for the occasion. The Vanguard deal is happening tonight, isn't it?" Richard scoffed, his chest puffing out beneath his bespoke charcoal suit. "Of course it's happening. Thomas Hinsley from Vanguard is sitting at table 1. The contracts have been vetted. I'll make the announcement during my keynote speech." He looked her up and down, his lip curling slightly. "Just sit at the table. Don't drink too much. Don't talk to the press. Let me and Olivia handle the heavy lifting." Right on cue, Olivia Pierce materialized from the crowd. If Claire was dressed like a weapon, Olivia was dressed like a victory lap. She wore a backless crimson gown with a plunging neckline, her blonde hair styled in flawless Hollywood waves. She looked less like a chief strategy officer and more like a woman preparing to step into the role of a billionaire's wife. "Richard, darling," Olivia purred, pointedly ignoring Claire. "Hinsley is asking for you. We need to go over the final optics before the speech." "Of course," Richard said, his entire demeanor softening as he looked at Olivia. He turned back to Claire, the coldness returning instantly. "Go sit down, Claire. We have business to attend to." Claire watched them walk away, Richard's hand resting entirely too low on Olivia's lower back. The blatant disrespect sent a ripple of murmurs through the nearby guests. In the ruthless hierarchy of New York high society, weakness was blood in the water. The elite wives of hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons were already casting pitying, mocking glances in Claire's direction behind their champagne flutes. They all knew what was happening. It was an age-old cliché. The starter wife being traded in for a newer, flashier model the moment the real money rolled in. Claire took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and casually made her way to table 1. Sitting directly across from her designated seat was Thomas Hinsley, the senior managing partner of the Vanguard Group. Hinsley was a silver-haired, blue-blooded shark who had orchestrated more hostile takeovers than anyone else on Wall Street. He possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. As Claire sat down, Hinsley looked up from his phone. He didn't offer the usual patronizing smile reserved for the wives of tech founders. Instead, he gave Claire a slow, deliberate nod of deep respect. "Mrs. Montgomery," Hinsley said quietly, intentionally using her maiden name, a detail that went completely unnoticed by the other oblivious executives at the table. "Mr. Hinsley," Claire replied, taking a slow sip of her water. "I trust the final drafts of the contract met your firm's expectations." "They were illuminating," Hinsley said, a razor-thin smile playing on his lips. It's rare to find such transparent architecture in a tech firm these days. Aegis Solutions was remarkably thorough in their audit. I look forward to the transition of power. As do I, Claire murmured, her eyes tracking Richard as he aggressively glad-handed his way across the ballroom. Olivia draped over his arm like a conqueror's prize. The trap was fully set. The bait had been taken. Richard thought he had outsmarted everyone. Vanguard, the market, and especially his quiet, obedient wife. He had no idea that the billion-dollar contract resting in Hinsley's briefcase didn't bear the name Harrison Dynamics. It bore the name Aegis Solutions. Vanguard wasn't buying Richard's company. They were buying the core algorithm directly from Claire, rendering Harrison Dynamics an empty, worthless shell. And Richard was about to walk onto a brightly lit stage to proudly announce his own financial execution. The lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed. A spotlight hit the main stage, illuminating a sleek glass podium. The jazz quartet faded out, replaced by a booming, cinematic bass drop that signaled the beginning of the presentation. It was time for the show. The applause was deafening as Richard Harrison sprinted up the stairs to the stage, exuding the manic, evangelical energy of a Silicon Valley god. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, pacing the width of the stage like a saunt tiger, letting the applause wash over him. He held up a hand, and the room of 500 elites obediently fell silent. "Welcome!" Richard's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with manufactured humility. 10 years ago, Harrison Dynamics was nothing but a whiteboard and a dream in a run-down Brooklyn apartment. Today, we are the logistical heartbeat of the modern world. We route the cargo ships, we direct the supply chains, we make the global economy move. Claire sat perfectly still at table 1, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She felt the heavy gaze of Thomas Hinsley resting on her, watching her reaction. She offered nothing but a serene, placid mask. "We couldn't have gotten here without vision," Richard continued, his voice dropping into a somber, emotional register. "But vision requires evolution. It requires shedding the things that hold us back. Sometimes companies outgrow their original foundations, and sometimes people do too." A nervous electric tension rippled through the ballroom. This wasn't standard corporate rhetoric. This was deeply, uncomfortably personal. Richard stopped pacing and stood dead center on the stage. He looked directly down at table 1. He looked at Claire. "For the past decade, I have been married to a woman who was there at the beginning," Richard said, his tone shifting from inspirational to patronizingly sorrowful. "Claire, I want to thank you for the quiet support you gave me when this was just a dream. But the reality of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise requires a partner who can stand on the front lines, who understands the ruthless velocity of the modern market. You have always been a woman of simple tastes, content in the background. And while I will always respect our past, I must look toward the future." He took a dramatic pause. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, suffocating. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Several people at nearby tables physically cringed, turning away from the brutal, unvarnished cruelty unfolding on stage. "Effective immediately, Claire and I are separating," Richard announced, the words echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Our legal teams are already in motion. It is a necessary step for my personal growth and for the security of Harrison Dynamics." Before the shock could fully register with the crowd, Before the whispers could escalate into a roar, Richard pivoted seamlessly. Because tonight, I am not just announcing a new chapter in my personal life. I am announcing the evolution of this company. Tonight, Harrison Dynamics is finalizing a $1.2 billion merger with the Vanguard Group. The crowd gasped. A few sycophants began to clap, but the applause was hesitant, confused by the emotional whiplash of a public divorce, instantly followed by a corporate merger. To lead us into this new era, Richard shouted, his face flushed with triumph and adrenaline, I need a true equal by my side. Someone whose brilliance and strategic mind engineered this Vanguard deal from the ground up. Please welcome to the stage my Chief Strategy Officer and my partner in every sense of the word, Olivia Pierce. The spotlight swung wildly, catching Olivia as she stood up from a nearby table. She feigned a look of touching surprise, placing a manicured hand over her heart before gliding towards the stage. The red dress trailed behind her like spilled blood. When she reached the podium, Richard pulled her into a deep, highly inappropriate embrace, kissing her passionately in front of 500 people, numerous journalists, and flashing cameras. It was the ultimate humiliation. A meticulously choreographed public execution of Claire's dignity. Richard hadn't just divorced her, he had replaced her on a literal stage, claiming her life's work as his own, and attributing the final victory to his mistress. Richard pulled away from Olivia, both of them beaming, breathless. He looked down at table 1 again, his eyes locking onto Claire with vicious, arrogant triumph. Claire, Richard said into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. I think it would be best if you left now. This VIP table is reserved for the key architects of the Vanguard merger. Security can escort you to your car. The ballroom held its collective breath. All eyes snapped to the woman in the emerald green gown. They expected tears. They expected a dramatic exit, a glass thrown, a sobbing retreat to the bathrooms. Instead, Claire Montgomery picked up her linen napkin, dabbed the corners of her mouth elegantly, and stood up. She didn't look at the security guards, stepping nervously forward from the shadows. She didn't look at the pitying of the socialites. She looked directly at Thomas Hinsley. Hinsley slowly rose to his feet. He buttoned his suit jacket, picked up his leather briefcase, and turned to face the stage. The coldness in his eyes was absolute. Mr. Harrison, Hinsley's voice cut through the room without the aid of a microphone. It carried the chilling, authoritative weight of a man who controlled billions of dollars. There seems to be a profound misunderstanding regarding the nature of tonight's agreements. Richard blinked, his victorious smile faltering slightly. Thomas? What do you mean? We've reviewed the term sheets. We're ready to sign. Vanguard is indeed prepared to sign a $1.2 billion acquisition contract tonight, Hinsley said, his voice ringing out in the dead-silent ballroom. However, after a rigorous third-party audit of Harrison Dynamics over the past 6 months, my firm discovered that your company does not legally own the proprietary algorithmic architecture that makes your software functional. The color rapidly drained from Richard's face. He let go of Olivia's hand. That's impossible. We hold the patents. We have the trademark. You hold the trademark to a brand name, Mr. Harrison, Hinsley interrupted brutally. But the core code, the mathematical architecture that prevents your entire global routing system from crashing every 48 hours, is unequivocally copyrighted and owned by a private entity known as Aegis Solutions. Whispers erupted across the room. Journalists from the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg scrambled for their phones, sensing a massacre. "Aegis Solutions," Richard stammered, gripping the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "Who the hell is Aegis Solutions? I've never heard of them. This is a mistake. Olivia, what is he talking about?" Olivia was frozen, her mouth slightly open, staring at Hinsley in horror. Claire took a step forward, moving out from behind table 1. The spotlight that was tracking the stage suddenly seemed entirely too dim compared to the radiant, terrifying calm emanating from her. "Aegis Solutions," Claire said, her voice clear, steady, and carrying perfectly across the silent expanse of the grand ballroom, "is a private holding company established 7 years ago. Under New York State intellectual property law, any code I wrote prior to our marriage and maintained strictly outside of Harrison Dynamics' payroll belongs entirely to me." She reached into her Chanel bag and pulled out the thick, leather-bound portfolio. "I am the sole proprietor of Aegis Solutions, Richard," Claire continued, walking slowly toward the center of the room, every camera pivoting to follow her. "And as of this morning, Vanguard is not buying Harrison Dynamics. They are buying Aegis. They are buying my algorithm." Richard looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The illusion of his genius was fracturing in real time, broadcast live, to the very people he had spent a decade trying to impress. "Which means," Claire said, stopping at the foot of the stage and looking up at the man who had just tried to destroy her, "Harrison Dynamics is now legally operating unlicensed, stolen software. Thomas Hinsley and I have already filed the injunction. By tomorrow morning, your company will be valued at exactly 0. Claire smiled then, a devastating, brilliant smile that she had kept hidden for far too long. "So, Richard, about that divorce." The silence that had suffocated the grand ballroom shattered all at once, replaced by a deafening roar of chaos. It was as if someone had thrown a live grenade into a room full of glass. 500 of New York's most powerful elite lost their carefully curated composure simultaneously. Cell phones were suddenly raised in the air, recording the spectacular implosion of a tech giant in real time. The flashing of camera bulbs turned the dim ballroom into a frantic strobe light of journalistic frenzy. On the stage, Richard Harrison looked as though the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. His golden retriever charm had melted away, leaving behind a pale, trembling shell of a man. He gripped the edges of the glass podium so tightly that his knuckles were bone white, his eyes darting frantically between Claire, who stood poised at the foot of the stage, and Thomas Hinsley, who remained standing with the cold, immovable presence of a seasoned executioner. "This is a bluff," Richard croaked into the microphone, his voice cracking. He sounded like a terrified child. He tried to project authority, but it came out as a desperate plea. This is extortion. You can't just steal my company, Claire. We are married. Half of everything you own is mine under New York state law." Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sheer gravity of her presence demanded attention, and the crowd eagerly leaned in to catch every word. "Actually, Richard, under standard intellectual property statutes, assets developed and patented prior to a marriage, entirely separate from marital funds, remain sole property," Claire stated, her voice slicing through the murmurs like a scalpel. She opened the leather-bound portfolio and held up a densely typed legal document bearing the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Aegis Solutions was incorporated in Delaware 3 years before we stood at City Hall. The copyright for the dynamic routing architecture was filed 2 years before that. I never transferred the IP to Harrison Dynamics. I merely allowed you to use it. A verbal, revocable license between spouses. And tonight, I am revoking it. "She's lying!" Richard shouted, spit flying from his lips, his panic blinding him to the optics of a CEO screaming at his wife in front of Wall Street's most influential players. He turned wildly to Thomas Hinsley. "Thomas, look at her. She's a disgruntled spouse trying to ruin a billion-dollar merger out of spite. Vanguard can't possibly entertain this madness." Thomas Hinsley slowly adjusted his silver cufflinks, looking at Richard with an expression of profound disgust. In the world of high finance, ignorance was a far greater sin than malice. "Mr. Harrison, Vanguard does not deal in madness, nor do we write billion-dollar checks without conducting forensic due diligence," Hinsley said smoothly, his voice cutting through the noise. "When my analysts looked under the hood of your software, they discovered the core architecture was heavily encrypted and registered to a third party. We initiated a discreet inquiry, which led us directly to Aegis Solutions. The SEC filings are already being updated as we speak. Vanguard is acquiring Aegis Solutions. Harrison Dynamics is no longer a factor in this transaction." Richard physically recoiled as if he had been struck. The reality was crashing down on him. He wasn't the visionary. He wasn't the billionaire. He was a glorified salesman who had just been caught selling a stolen car. He spun around to look at Olivia Pierce, desperate for an ally, for his brilliant chief strategy officer to spin this unmitigated disaster. But Olivia was a creature of Wall Street, a pure, unadulterated survivalist. She had spent her entire career climbing the ladder, and she knew exactly when a rung was about to snap. As Richard reached out for her, Olivia literally took a step back, holding her hands up, her eyes wide with manufactured horror. "Richard, I had no idea," Olivia stammered, projecting her voice just enough for the front tables and the recording cell phones to hear. The performance was Oscar-worthy. "You told me you owned the proprietary code. You assured the board. My God, Richard, did you commit corporate fraud?" "What?" Richard gasped, his eyes wide with betrayal. "Olivia, we planned this. We wrote the emails together." "I don't know what you are talking about," Olivia said, her voice trembling perfectly. She looked out at the crowd, playing the victim with terrifying efficiency. "I was brought in to optimize a merger, not to facilitate the theft of intellectual property. I resign, effective immediately." With that, she turned on her $5,000 stilettos and walked briskly off the stage, disappearing into the shadows behind the heavy velvet curtains, leaving Richard utterly alone under the blinding spotlight. The crowd erupted again. The journalists from Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal were already furiously typing on their phones, drafting headlines that would send shockwaves through the global markets by morning. Claire watched Richard crumble. 10 years of his condescension, 10 years of his blatant disrespect, 10 years of being hidden away like an embarrassing secret. It all washed away in the glow of his spectacular ruin. She didn't feel pity. She didn't feel anger. She felt free. She closed her portfolio and turned to Thomas Hinsley. "Mr. Hinsley," Claire said politely, completely ignoring the man weeping on the stage behind her. I believe we have a signing dinner to attend at Le Bernardin. The reservation is for 10. "Indeed we do, Miss Montgomery," Hinsley smiled, offering her his arm. "My legal team is waiting in the private dining room. Shall we?" Without a backward glance, Claire Montgomery placed her hand on the arm of the most powerful private equity shark in New York and walked out of the grand ballroom. Behind her, the symphony of Richard Harrison's destruction played on, a chaotic crescendo of shouting reporters, panicked executives, and the distinct sound of a massive, fragile ego shattering into a million pieces. The next morning, Manhattan was bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a crisp November dawn. But the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom of Harrison Dynamics was as dark and suffocating as a crypt. Located on the 54th floor of a glass and steel monolith in Midtown, the boardroom offered panoramic views of the city. Richard Harrison had believed he owned just 12 hours prior. Now the view only served as a dizzying reminder of how far he was about to fall. At 8:00 a.m., the emergency meeting of the Harrison Dynamics Board of Directors commenced. The 12 men and women seated around the massive mahogany table looked physically ill. They were seasoned venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and tech veterans, all of whom had heavily leveraged their portfolios on the Vanguard merger. The morning papers and financial blogs were already screaming with headlines. Harrison Dynamics, CEO ousted in IP fraud scandal. Vanguard pivots to secretive architect. Pre-market trading for Harrison Dynamics, partner companies, was in free fall. The SEC had already announced a preliminary probe into Richard's disclosures. Richard sat at the head of the table, though he looked nothing like a CEO. He was wearing the same wrinkled suit from the Gala. His hair was a chaotic mess, his face pale and unshaven, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night spent screaming at lawyers who had universally told him the exact same thing: "You are finished." "We need a statement," demanded Arthur Sterling, a senior partner at a prominent venture capital firm and the lead investor in Harrison Dynamics. Arthur's face was purple with rage. "We need to tell the shareholders that this is a domestic dispute. We need to sue her, Richard. Sue Vanguard, sue Aegis, file an injunction against the acquisition." "On what grounds, Arthur?" Richard mumbled, rubbing his temples, his voice hollow. "My lawyers They spent all night checking. The Aegis copyright is airtight. She filed it before we even signed our first office lease. We don't own the code." A collective groan echoed through the room. "So what exactly do we own, Richard?" asked a female board member from Palo Alto, her voice dripping with venom. "Because if we don't own the algorithm, this company is just a collection of ergonomic desk chairs and a fancy logo." Before Richard could answer, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The security guard outside didn't even attempt to stop them. Claire walked in. Flanking her was Thomas Hinsley, and trailing just behind them were 3 senior litigators from Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen and Katz, the most feared corporate law firm on the eastern seaboard. Claire looked spectacular. Gone was the emerald evening gown, replaced by a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal grey suit by Alexander McQueen. Her posture was flawless, her expression unreadable. She walked to the opposite end of the table, directly facing Richard. "What is she doing here?" Arthur demanded, standing up. "This is a closed board meeting." "Sit down, Arthur," Thomas Hinsley commanded quietly. The venture capitalist hesitated, but the sheer, terrifying weight of Vanguard's $8 trillion in assets under management forced him back into his leather chair. "I am here to offer a lifeline," Claire said, placing a sleek black folder onto the table. "As you are all painfully aware, as of 9:00 a.m. this morning, the Vanguard Group officially acquired Aegis Solutions, and by extension, the absolute licensing rights to the proprietary routing algorithm you have been illegally profiting from. Richard stared at her, his eyes pleading. Claire, please. You've made your point. You humiliated me. You won. Let's just talk about this privately. We are talking privately, Richard. Just you, me, and the board you lied to for 5 years, Claire replied coldly. She turned her attention to the rest of the room. Currently, Harrison Dynamics is dead in the water. I have drafted an immediate cease and desist order. If I execute it, your servers will shut down at noon today. Every supply chain, every shipping conglomerate, and every logistics network relying on your software will go dark. You will be sued into oblivion by your clients for breach of contract, and you will all be personally investigated by the SEC for securities fraud. The boardroom was dead silent. The board members looked at the black folder as if it contained a live bomb. However, Claire continued, her voice perfectly level, Vanguard is not in the business of destroying infrastructure. We are in the business of optimizing it. I am prepared to offer Harrison Dynamics an exclusive, perpetual licensing agreement to continue using the Aegis architecture. The company will survive. Your investments will not go to zero. A collective breath of relief swept through the board members, but it was abruptly cut short by Arthur. What are the terms, Ms. Montgomery? Arthur asked suspiciously. What do you want? 3 things, Claire said, ticking them off on her fingers. First, Vanguard takes a 40% equity stake in Harrison Dynamics, effectively making us the majority controlling shareholder. Second, the licensing fee will be set at 30% of your gross annual revenue, payable quarterly to Aegis Solutions. The board murmured in shock. It was extortionate. It was a bloodletting. But it was infinitely better than bankruptcy and federal prison. And the third condition? Arthur asked, bracing himself. Claire locked eyes with the golden boy of tech, the man who had treated her like an embarrassing secret, the man who had planned to throw her away so he could fund his new life with a 26-year-old PR executive. Richard Harrison resigns as CEO, effective immediately, Claire stated, her voice echoing off the glass walls. He steps down from the board. He forfeits his founder's equity back into the company pool due to gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. He walks out of this building with nothing. You can't do that, Richard screamed, jumping to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor behind him. This is my company. I built this. You can't just erase me. I built the engine, Richard. You just painted the car, Claire said, her gaze unwavering. And now I'm taking the keys. She looked away from him, addressing the terrified board members. You have 60 seconds to vote. If the terms are rejected, Mr. Hinsley will make a phone call, the servers go down, and the cease and desist is filed with the federal court. The clock starts now. The boardroom erupted into frantic, hushed arguments, but the outcome was never in doubt. Capitalists do not possess loyalty, they possess survival instincts. All in favor of accepting Ms. Montgomery's terms, Arthur said quickly, raising his hand. 11 other hands shot into the air with desperate speed. The motion carries, Arthur declared, looking at Richard with absolute disgust. Richard, you need to leave the building. Your keycard has been deactivated. Richard stood frozen, staring at the forest of raised hands. The people who had worshipped him yesterday were now enthusiastically cutting his throat to save their own skin. He looked at Claire, his chest heaving, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. You ruined my life, he whispered, his voice cracking. No, Richard, Claire replied softly, stepping aside to let the security guards enter the room to escort him out. "I just stopped letting you ruin mine." Cold rain battered the reinforced glass of the Vanguard Group's executive suites, distorting the Manhattan skyline into streaks of grey and bruised purple. Inside, the climate control hummed a low, steady bass line, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. Claire Montgomery stood by the window, her fingertips resting against the cool, condensation-slicked glass. She wasn't wearing a designer gown today. She wore a heavy knit cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, the uniform of a woman who no longer needed to dress for a camera. On the flat-screen monitor, mounted to the far wall, CNBC's Squawk Box played on mute. The ticker at the bottom of the screen flashed red and green numbers in an endless stream. Andrew Ross Sorkin was leaning forward across the desk, animatedly discussing the unprecedented corporate coup that had upended the tech sector. The chyron beneath him read, "Aegis Solutions assumes control of Harrison Dynamics. SEC probe expands." It had been 4 months since the gala. 4 months since Claire had detonated the explosive truth in front of 500 witnesses. The fallout had been swift, brutal, and meticulously executed. Claire had moved her operations out of the Tribeca penthouse, which was currently sitting empty, locked in escrow, and into Vanguard's fortress-like headquarters on Madison Avenue. She was no longer the silent architect. She was the acting chief technology officer of the newly formed Vanguard Aegis Logistics Division, overseeing a team of 200 engineers. The transition wasn't a fairy tale. It was exhausting, gritty work. Claire spent her days buried in code architecture, her eyes burning from the harsh blue light of dual monitors, her fingernails bitten down to the quick. She tasted stale coffee and the metallic tang of adrenaline constantly. But for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't fixing someone else's mistakes in the dark. She was building something under her own name. Thomas Hinsley walked into her office, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind him. He dropped a thick stack of manila folders onto her desk. The sharp thud echoed in the quiet room. "The SEC subpoenaed Richard's personal bank records this morning," Hinsley said. His voice flat, devoid of sympathy. He pulled out a leather chair and sat, crossing one leg over the other. "They found the offshore accounts, the ones he set up with Olivia Pierce right after he initiated the Vanguard negotiations. He was attempting to move company funds to the Cayman Islands to hide them from the marital asset pool." Claire turned away from the window. She felt no shock, only the dull, heavy confirmation of her ex-husband's absolute lack of morality. "And Olivia?" Claire asked, walking over to her desk. She ran her hand over the smooth, polished wood, grounding herself in the physical texture of the room. "Cooperating fully with the federal prosecutors," Hinsley replied, a dry, humorless smirk touching his lips. She cut a heavily immunized deal with the Department of Justice, turned over every email, every text message, and every recorded phone call. She threw him to the wolves to save her own skin. Last I heard, she took a lateral PR role at a mid-tier firm in Chicago. As for Richard, Hinsley paused, tapping the top folder. "His legal defense fund has dried up. His assets are frozen. The banks called in the loans on his personal real estate." Richard's reality was a stark contrast to the sterile, high-altitude calm of Vanguard. 6 miles away, in a cramped, sub-leased studio apartment in Long Island City, Richard Harrison sat on a sagging mattress that smelled of mildew and stale sweat. The golden boy of Wall Street was gone. His tailored charcoal suits were hanging in a plastic garment bag in a closet that wouldn't close properly. He wore faded grey sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, his hair greasy, his face covered in a thick, unkempt beard. The constant rattling vibration of the N train, passing over the elevated tracks, shook dust from the ceiling every 15 minutes. Richard stared at his laptop screen. His inbox, once flooded with invitations to Davos and private dinners at Le Bernardin, with hedge fund managers like Bill Ackman, was now a wasteland of automated alerts from debt collectors and past-due notices. He reached for a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon on the nightstand. The glass clinked against his teeth as he drank, the cheap alcohol burning a harsh, acidic trail down his throat. He coughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He had tried to leverage his contacts. He had called every venture capitalist, every tech incubator, every friend he had bought expensive dinners for over the last 5 years. Most of the calls went straight to voicemail. The few who did pick up offered brief, hollow condolences before abruptly ending the conversation. He was toxic, a pariah, a man who had not only committed intellectual property fraud, but had been publicly outsmarted by the wife he had treated like a servant. He opened a new tab and typed Claire's name into the search bar. Images flooded the screen. Claire standing next to Thomas Hinsley at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new server farm in Virginia. Claire profiled in the New York Times deal book, wearing a sharp blazer, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held zero hesitation. The headline read, "The architect steps out of the shadows." Richard slammed the laptop shut. The sharp plastic crack echoed in the small, damp room. He buried his face in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. He could hear the rain lashing against the thin window pane, a constant, mocking reminder of the night he had lost everything. He had wanted to be a king, but he had forgotten who built the castle. Now he was buried under the rubble, completely and utterly alone. 7 months to the day after the gala, the divorce mediation was scheduled for its final, absolute conclusion. The conference room at Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen and Katz was excessively air-conditioned, raising goosebumps on Claire's arms. The massive oak table stretched between the two parties like a physical battlefield. The room smelled of fresh printer ink, bitter black coffee, and the faint, sterile scent of lemon polish on the wood. Claire sat flanked by 3 senior litigators. She wore a simple, structured navy wool coat over a white blouse. She felt calm. The frantic, pounding anxiety that had defined the last year of her marriage was completely gone, replaced by a deep, quiet stillness. She watched the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the blinds. The heavy door opened, and Richard walked in, accompanied by a single, exhausted-looking public defender tier attorney he had managed to scrounge up on retainer. Claire barely recognized him. The man who sat down across from her looked hollowed out. His skin had a grey, sallow tint, and the tailored suit he wore hung loosely on his frame, at least 2 sizes too big now. The golden charisma was entirely extinguished. He smelled faintly of stale tobacco and the metallic, sour odor of profound stress. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the thick stack of separation documents resting in the center of the table. "Let's proceed," Claire's lead attorney said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The terms have been mediated and finalized. Mr. Harrison forfeits all claims to the Tribeca property, which has been liquidated. The proceeds will cover the penalties accrued from the unauthorized licensing of Aegis Solutions software. He retains no equity in Harrison Dynamics, nor any shares in the Vanguard Aegis merger. In exchange, Ms. Montgomery agrees not to pursue further civil damages regarding the IP theft. Richard's lawyer nudged him. "Sign the papers, Richard." Richard reached for the heavy silver pen on the table. His hand was visibly trembling. The metallic scratching of the nib against the thick parchment paper was the only sound in the room. He signed his name on page after page, signing away the penthouse, the company, the fortune, and the marriage. When he reached the final page, he stopped. He gripped the pen so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Slowly, he looked up, meeting Claire's eyes for the first time in 7 months. Was it worth it? Richard's voice was a ragged, wet whisper, completely stripped of its former arrogance. "To take everything? To leave me with nothing?" Claire didn't flinch. She didn't offer a triumphant smirk. She just looked at him, feeling the heavy, grounded reality of the leather chair beneath her, hearing the faint hum of the city traffic through the thick glass. "I didn't take anything from you, Richard," Claire said, her voice soft but entirely devoid of warmth. "I just stopped giving you what was mine. You built your entire life on my foundation, and then you tried to throw me out the door. The moment you did that, the house collapsed. You did this to yourself." "I made a mistake," he choked out, a single tear cutting a track through the exhaustion on his face. "Olivia, the money. It blinded me. Claire, I have nothing. My accounts are seized. I'm facing federal charges. I'm renting a room in Queens. And for 10 years I rented a space in my own marriage," Claire replied, picking up her own pen. She didn't look at him anymore. She pulled the final document toward her. The texture of the paper was heavy and rough under her fingers. With a few fluid strokes, she signed her name. Claire Montgomery. Not Harrison. Never Harrison again. She stood up, buttoning her navy coat. She picked up her leather portfolio, the same one she had carried to the Plaza Hotel. "Goodbye, Richard." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the conference room. Her heels clicked a steady, rhythmic cadence against the hardwood floor of the law firm's hallway. She stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the lobby. The stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the Wachtell offices. When Claire pushed through the revolving doors of the high-rise and stepped out onto the street, the cold November air hit her lungs like a shock of electricity. The sidewalks were packed with commuters, moving with the frantic, relentless energy of New York. The smell of roasting nuts from a nearby street cart mixed with the sharp scent of exhaust fumes. She took a deep breath, letting the chaotic, beautiful noise of the city wash over her. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door for her. "Back to the Vanguard offices, Ms. Montgomery?" the driver asked respectfully. "Yes, please," Claire said. She slid into the leather seat, looking out the tinted window as the car merged into the heavy traffic. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the dim cabin. Lines of complex code reflected in her eyes. The past was finally dead, buried under a mountain of legal documents and shattered ego. The future was unwritten, and for the first time in her life, she was the only one holding the pen. The line between blind loyalty and self-destruction is thinner than we think. Claire's story isn't just about corporate revenge. It's a brutal reminder that the people who silently build the foundation are the only ones holding the power to tear it all down. Richard Harrison let his ego convince him that the crown made the king, forgetting that without the architect, the castle is just a pile of waiting rubble. Know your worth, secure your boundaries, and never let anyone relegate your brilliance to the shadows. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the wildest, most dramatic real-life stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the company or walked away? Let's talk about it.